Welcome to this GCSE Biology revision video on transport in cells, and today I'm going to be looking at diffusion. In biology, substances have to move in and out of cells and across cell membranes. Diffusion is probably one of the key fundamental cornerstones of biology, and understanding the principles will help you to understand a lot about plants, animals and living things. A couple of examples in diffusion are shown here. For example, in your lungs, within the alveoli, you have to diffuse oxygen into your blood. Okay, and you need to diffuse carbon dioxide out of your blood. In plant cells, through stomata, carbon dioxide and oxygen can be diffused in and out of the plant. So diffusion is really an essential part of living things, and it's really important to understand what also affects the rates of diffusion as well. Diffusion can be defined as the spreading out of the particles of gas or of any substance in solution. This results in the net movement of particles from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So if you look at this diagram here, okay, you can see that there is a higher concentration of oxygen molecules on the one side of the cell membrane, and then as you can see that the oxygen molecules will travel through from where they are in a higher concentration to an area of lower concentration, and eventually you'll notice that they reach a point where there's equal numbers of oxygen molecules either side of the cell, and that is better known as an equilibrium. The really cool thing about diffusion is that it doesn't require any extra energy. The only energy required is from kinetic energy. You don't need any metabolic energy for diffusion to occur. So in this example we've got a higher concentration on the left side of the membrane compared to the right side, and you'll see that they'll start to move around. As they move around, they'll start to move through the membrane. Now they can move both ways, but the higher concentration it will move to a lower concentration. And they'll continue to do this until they reach some sort of equilibrium or balance between both sides of the membrane. So the speed of diffusion, or the rate of diffusion, can be controlled by three main factors that we're going to look at next. The first factor to affect the rate of diffusion is the concentration gradient. If there's a big difference in concentration between two areas, diffusion will take place quickly. So if we look at this diagram that I've got, the diagram I'm depicting the concentration gradient like a slide. So if you imagine a higher concentration gradient at the top of the slide, okay, and the movement of molecules down the concentration gradient to a lower concentration gradient. Obviously the higher the difference, so the difference between the higher and the lower concentrations, the faster molecules will move. So here's a question for you related to concentration gradient. Which slide will allow you to go down faster? It's not a trick question, but hopefully you've all said A, because that would be the correct answer. But how is that related to concentration gradient? So if we look at slide A, we can see that slide A has a steep gradient, okay, compared to slide B that has a less steep gradient. So if we relate that to the rate of diffusion, if you look on the steeper concentration gradient, that means there are more molecules on one side compared to the other. Whereas if there's a less steep concentration gradient, that you've got less molecules, still a higher amount of molecules, than this side, but they're kind of more equal. So therefore there'll be a slower rate of diffusion. So in general, the greater the difference in concentration between either side of the membrane, the faster the rate of diffusion is. And this difference between the two areas of concentration is known as the concentration gradient. The bigger the difference, the steeper the concentration gradient, and the faster the rate of diffusion. So in other words, we say diffusion occurs down a concentration gradient. A bit like this slide, down the concentration gradient. It's a good way to remember what concentration gradient means. The second factor is temperature. This experiment shows a simple experiment where they've used potassium permanganate and placed it in a beaker with different temperatures of water. And as you can see, the 30 degrees beaker, the potassium permanganate has diffused through the water quicker than at 5 degrees. So we can say that the higher the temperature, the faster the rate of diffusion. This means the particles in a gas or a solution will move around more quickly. So particles will move randomly, but they will hit each other, for example, and when this happens, diffusion takes place more rapidly as the random movement of the particles speeds up. So the third factor is the surface area to volume ratio of the cell. Some individual cells are adapted to make diffusion easier and more rapid. For example, the cells in the small intestine and also the alveoli in the lungs, they all have a large surface area. So you can see that the cell on the right side has a much more folded cell membrane. So the volume of the cells are very similar, but the second cell has a much larger surface area to volume ratio, and that increases the rate of diffusion. So here is an example of where a cell will have a large surface area. So in the small intestine, if you were to look inside the small intestine, it has lots and lots of folds of the intestinal lining called the villi. And then you look at one villi or a villus, and within that are these cells here, which are known as the epithelial cells. And even further down you can see these microvilli. So that greatly increases the surface area through which diffusion can occur of digested molecules. Here is a unicellular or single-celled organism, an amoeba, that is found in ponds or in puddles. It's very small, and you can see that it has to diffuse oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. It has a relatively large surface area to volume ratio, and this allows sufficient transport of molecules into and out of the cell to meet the needs of this organism. Whereas in multicellular organisms such as humans and many other animals, you're going to notice that you can't really diffuse between the outside and inside environment very quickly unless you have exchange surfaces and a transport system to allow the movement of things like oxygen into cells and getting waste such as carbon dioxide out. To summarise, temperature, you have faster diffusion. Surface area, a larger surface area, again faster diffusion. Concentration gradient, the higher the gradient or the steeper the gradient, diffuses faster. And then two other things that probably won't come up, but it's important to note that if you've got smaller particles, they will diffuse faster, and obviously the medium is important as well. In this case, we're interested in gases and liquids. If it's coming from a gas, it's fastest, whereas liquid it's faster, and that's related to the density of the medium. Many surfaces in a multicellular organism are adapted for exchanging materials to get enough molecules to be transported in and out of cells for the organism's needs. So if we look at humans, the way we exchange gases is by breathing, and the gases being diffused through the lungs and the part of the lung called the alveoli. You will be learning about lungs in the organisation section of the work, and I will be doing a video on that at a later date. However, this just quickly shows you the kind of effectiveness of a gas exchange surface, and this is the same kind of principles for many things. So first of all, ventilation, so the surface is being ventilated, so you're keeping the concentrations of gases high. So when you breathe in, there's going to be more oxygen molecules, higher concentration of oxygen molecules in your alveoli, and they'll diffuse into the red blood cells, as the red blood cells are deoxygenated at this point and they're picking up oxygen. The alveoli has a massive surface area to increase the rate of diffusion. So there's about 150 million alveoli in your lungs, and that means that there is a massive surface area. Also, the membrane, the cell membrane, is really thin, so in the alveoli it's one cell thick, and so is the capillary, so that reduces the distance for diffusion, or it provides a short diffusion pathway. And then lastly, you've got moving blood supply, so if it's moving, that again will maintain the concentration gradients. So that's a really good example, and it occurs in other parts of the body, such as the small intestine. So far we've mentioned the small intestine and the lungs, and also in your studies you'll need to know that things like gills in the fish, gills in the fish, they have a massive surface area, thin membranes. They don't ventilate. Water flows past the gills that are oxygen rich, so it maintains a concentration gradient. And also you have to be aware that exchange occurs in the roots. Root hair cells have a massive surface area, and they're very thin membranes as well, and again exchange through the stomata of the leaf, and also diffusion is aided by air gaps in the spongy mesophyll. So those are examples you would need to know, but they all have the main characteristics of good exchange surfaces. They have a large surface area, thin membrane, and in animals they've got an efficient blood supply, and they are ventilated. So those are 4 main points to remember about good gas exchange surfaces to allow efficient and rapid diffusion. I hope you found this video useful. The next video I'm looking at doing is about osmosis and then active transport, so please do subscribe to my channel for more revision videos.